Hello, so in this video, I'll be talking about differences between APIs and webhooks for AAA owners so you can finally understand what's going on behind the scene. Because I know a lot of AAA people, they use these local tools like Make.com and NAN, and you just drag and drop webhooks and copy and paste APIs, but they don't actually really understand what's going on behind the scene. And it's so important when you actually go on and build advanced or production ready automation built for clients, you need to understand what's going on with APIs and webhooks. So that's why I've made this video, and let's get straight into it. So an API is what we call an application programming interface. That's why it's called an API. It's an interface, right? So it's a set of rules that enables software or applications to communicate with each other to exchange data. So an example, if you're in the AAA space, you probably you probably heard of VoiceFlow, right? So within VoiceFlow, you know that there's an API stamp. Now, a very common use case is if you capture some lead data such as the booking time, name, and email within the conversational logic within VoiceFlow, is you just pass this information into some sort of make automation, right? Some sort of make workflow to kind of book the appointments for you. The process of communication from VoiceFlow to Make.com, that's an API because that is a communication between different software to exchange data, right? You are basically inputting the booking time, the name, and email from VoiceFlow, which is a software, to Make.com, which is another software, right? That is an API. So it's basically a way to kind of abstract the complexity of communication between different software. Now, what surprises a lot of people is that, I mean, this is straightforward, right? This is kind of what you basically do every day as for building automation builds. This is an API. But most people don't know that this is also an API. Sending data to a Gmail module, that is an API. You are basically by using this Gmail module, which is an API, you don't need to go to the Google server, find your account, fetch your information, and give back a response. Now, usually that's what you need to do on a very fundamental level. But Google company has made the Gmail API that allows you to automatically plug and play this Gmail module within Make.com, which makes the whole thing easier. This is what I meant by abstracting the complexity. Now, if you want to think about it at a more high level, is that you have the client, which is you, and let's say you're in a bar and you're trying to order a drink. Now, you will send a request to the bartender to say, oh, I want this specific cocktail, for example. Now, the bartender in this case will be the interface, right? That's the API. It will be the interface. API is an interface, right? So it's an interface. The bartender will take your order and try to mix the drinks. Now, the bartender will need to go behind the bar shelves and actually take different drinks, right? Let's say you need this drink, and this drink to mix together a cocktail for you. Now, because normally in a bar, you won't normally just go to a bar shelf and just mix it yourself unless you're a cocktail expert, right? So you will need to go through the bartender who helps you to prepare your drink. So in the same way as an API, you don't go to the Google server and fetch your own data. You go through this interface to help you get your data. So in this bar case, the bartender go and fetch the drinks, mix the drinks, and then give the drink back to the customer, which is you. So in the same way, an API will take your request, fetch your data, and communicate between the application and interface, fetch your data, and send a response back to you, the client, right? So hopefully this analogy makes sense. That's what's an API. This is what's an API. But think of the bartender. Now, there are actually different types of API. Now, as AAA owner, the only API that you normally would only need in a lot of the case is what we call the web APIs. There are different APIs, like you don't need to know about these, but in case you need it in the future, you know they are there. And you can look into it yourself. Like, I'm not going to talk to this in this video. You can Google it yourself. You can talk like there's SOAP APIs, the GraphQL APIs, which is for like very specific like database retrieval APIs. But if you're interested or if there's a need for that, for your use case, go ahead, Google it. But 90% of the case, you just need web APIs. And within web APIs, the most common one that we face as AAA people is the HTTP request. Now, an HTTP request is, as the name suggests, it's basically when you go to a website, you are sending an HTTP request or HTTPS request to a website. Even if you go to Google, that is a HTTPS request. Even going to Google on your browser right now is technically an API. You're sending a web API, right? Now, the full HTTP protocol is actually more nuanced, it's more complicated, I guess, to set up. And that is what we call a REST API. Now, you don't need to know what this is. Like, if you're interested, go ahead, like research it, but you don't really need it at least at this level. Now, I want you to really focus on the HTTP request. And I want you to understand that there are 4 components within the HTTP request. The first one is the URL. I mean, that makes sense, right? Because when you send an API from VoiceFlow to like the API step within a VoiceFlow, you would normally need to enter a URL, right? Because this is just to let the new system knows where's the file, like where's your data. I need a place to your data is stored somewhere, right? So this URL gives you the direction or the location of where's my data. Now within a URL, there are different components, just like how you normally go to Google, right? Let's say you search VoiceFlow in Google. You would have a scheme, which is HTTPS, right? Just standard. You have the host, which is Google. Google is the host. You are trying to retrieve data from the host from the Google server. You will have a path, which is search, right? Search question mark, that is the path. And then you will have the query parameter, which is if you're searching, let's say you go to Google and you search for VoiceFlow, then this will be your query parameter. This is basically letting the system know, okay, where's my data, right? I think this is pretty standard. Like this shouldn't be too, hopefully that's not too difficult to understand because that's what you do every day when you just go web browsing. You're doing this every day, right? I guarantee you. So this is just kind of breaking down like what's going on actually. The second component of an HTTP request is the method, which is basically letting the API know, okay, what action you need to take. You probably came across this before. Again, when you use the API block in VoiceFlow, you basically select the method here. The normal methods are get, which is you retrieve information, post, you're posting information, right? You're sending information. And then you have put, delete, and patch. Now, don't worry too much about these. These are basically updates. Like that, this is basically, I mean, delete. You know it's to delete things, right? It's pretty self-explanatory. But for put and patch, it's basically a way to update data. Now, again, this should be really standard. If you've been using voiceflow.me.com, this should be familiar to you. But I'm trying to formalize everything, right? So the third component of an HTTP request is the header. Now, the header basically provides context to the system, okay, what you are actually trying to do. Now, one of the examples of a header, as you can see here in the VoiceFlow API block, is content type application JSON. And I'm sure you've copy-pasted this a million times following some AI automation tutorials, right? So the reason why you're putting that in is because you're basically requesting the API to please respond in a specific format. Now, in this case, it will be asking the application to respond in a JSON format. Now, if you don't know what JSON is, it's just a very specific, it's a very specific format of communication. A really standard way of sending data back and forth, structured way. So I can make a separate video on JSON if you want, but I think you pretty much get what this is going, I hope, is that it's, because I know people copy paste this every time, at least I do in the API stuff, but I just really want you to understand why you're doing this, because you're requesting data to get back to you in JSON format. Now, you also have credentials, right? Again, this is just your API key. I know this, you need authorization, bearer, you basically have your API key. The reason why is because to basically let the API know, hey, you are actually allowed to access the data with the application that you're trying to access. You like the interface know, hey, this is me, it's my data, I'm allowed to do that, right? So that's why you need an API key every time you do an API request. And the fourth component of the HTTP request is a body. And it's really only meant for post API. Because remember, post API, you're actually putting information. You're actually posting information, sending information from you, the client, to the application, right? So basically, it's just what information you're sending, right? It's pretty straightforward, right? So hopefully, these four components, URL, method, header, and body, gives you a more formal way of understanding what a typical API request, specifically HTTP request, looks like when you're in some platforms like VoiceFlow or Make.com, right? Now, when you send an API request, you usually get a response, right? So you probably, again, have seen this, but I'm trying to formalize everything so you understand this. The first thing is the status code. It's a three-digit code basically saying, hey, how did the API request go? The interface basically say, okay, if it's 200, meaning everything's good. You're good to go, everything's okay. 401 means you're unauthorized, meaning that your credentials, your API key, doesn't match what's required for you to access the system. 404, not found. There's no such data. You probably made an error that no such files exist. For the URL that you request, basically, that the location that you say, well, the data doesn't exist in that location, right? 500, some sort of internal server error. You probably need to debug this. Something goes wrong. You just need to look at the response and see why, right? This is debugging. Now, with a typical API response, you will also get what we call header. So within header, this is, for example, an example VoiceFlow API response is you will have basically saying what the content type is or what the content length is. So the example will be the content type will be application JSON, right? So it's basically letting you know, the response is letting me, the client, knows that I'm getting the response of type JSON, or format JSON, right? I hope that makes sense. Now, the third thing is body, which is the information, which is what's the information that you requested, right? So these, for example, in JSON format, these are the specific data like the name, email, and inquiry. That's the specific data that you want from this API request, right? So hopefully this makes sense and not too complicated. Just status code, what's the status of the API request, the header, the context behind this response, such as the content type, which is in JSON format, and the body, which is the actual data that you want from the response, right? So hopefully this kind of gives you like a high-level overview of what an API is. Now, the biggest thing is, well, how is this different than a webhook? Because at Make.com, something like Make.com, right? When you go to Make.com, you create a webhook, you create a custom webhook, right? You do this if every automation build that you guys do, you will use a webhook, right? So how is this different to an API, right? You might ask, which is a very valid question. So a webhook is actually called a reverse API. Now, from the name, you probably can guess what it means, but it's just a reverse API. There's a reason why. Basically, a webhook is an event-driven callback mechanism. What I mean by that is that the server will let you know when an event occurs, right? So remember, in API is you go from the client to the server, right? You go from the client, you request something to the server, right? That is what we call pull. But in a webhook, it's basically the other way around. It's basically the server letting the client knows that, oh, this happens, or this event occurs, for example. And this is what we call a push. So you can see how like it's the reverse API, because it's instead of going from client to server, a webhook is from server to client, letting the client know, notifies the client, hey, this happens, right? And normally they require a callback URL. That is exactly why when you create a webhook in Make.com, when you click add and you just click save, that is why you have a URL. That is the request URL, right? So there's a reason why you're doing these things within make.com or NAN, right? Now, there are different types of webhooks triggers. There's polling and there's instant. Polling just means that this basically the client keep asking the server every minute for an update. So you basically every 1 minute you ask the server, hey, has anyone sent me an email? Hey, has anyone sent me an email? You basically think of it like if you're kind of asking like Google, like, hey, have I got an email? Have I got an email? You're just checking your phone. You're asking Google to basically let you know, hey, let me know every minute if an email has been sent to me, right? This is what polling is. Keep checking for a time interval. An instant trigger is basically whenever data is received, it notifies you. So basically, you let Google know, hey Google. So whenever I get an email, just let me know. Yeah, whenever I get an email, just notify me. That's what an instant is. So there's a difference between polling and instant trigger within a webhook. Now, if you want to go back to the bartender example, is that the client now, let's say you ordered a drink and you're just kind of waiting, right? And the bartender is now taking this drinks, this cocktail, and trying to make the perfect cocktail, and he's mixing. Now, the bartender will let you know, access the webhook, and basically let you know, hey, the drinks is ready. There you go. You as the client can do the polling. Basically, you asking the bartender, hey, how's the mixing going? Is it going well? Like, is the drink ready? And then the webhook will basically, nah, it's not ready yet, or oh yeah, it is ready, right? So hopefully that makes sense. I know it's a quite weird example, but basically, webhook is just they letting you know when something happens, right? But you can set it as a polling trigger or an instant trigger. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully by watching this video, you have a clearer understanding of why you're doing certain things. Next time you set up some sort of API steps or webhooks within this automation platform. Thank you.